This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Irvin Hunt, who teaches in the departments of English and of African American Studies at University of Illinois. He is the author of Dreaming the Present, Time, Aesthetics, and the Black Cooperative Movement, which won honorable mention in the William Scarborough Sanders Prize competition in 2023, and he is at work on two books, a study of contemporary Black poetry titled A New Language for Grief, and another titled I Can't Make You Speak, Stories. In this conversation, we discuss the critical Black literary tradition, horizons of expressive culture, and the politics of thinking and doing Black studies in the contemporary moment. Good afternoon, Irvin. How are you doing today?
Great, John. Thanks for having me on the show.
Super excited we found time to talk on the podcast. Really interested in getting your perspective. Is part of the series for lots of reasons. I really loved your book. I know you're just coming out with the film. I have a chance to talk about that. And so, there's so many things that you do that I think are really central to both the past and future of Black studies. So when we arranged this time, I was like, this is a really important voice to have on here. And you're one of many people actually from University of Illinois. We're like representing your department really well.
Shout out to Leonard.
Yeah, and Abdul and a couple other people. So, but welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. Looking forward to this conversation and all that'll come with it. And just really glad you made the time.
Yeah, man. Well, I'm so happy to be here. This is a fabulous podcast. I've really been enjoying listening to it.
And as we were saying before, I'm really happy that you've got your professional microphone. So we're like Studio Black Studies here.
I thought we were going to be low key about it. Like, it's just going to be like the most resonant interview ever.
I feel like we should have some like brown liquor and deepen my voice.
A little scotch on the side. Why not?
88.3 Black Studies FM. But so we'll have a chance to talk about your work, how your research, how you imagine the field and all of these things. But I want to start really with a more personal question, which is, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And for me, always this question that comes with that, what sustained you in relation to this kind of work?
The first word that comes to me is haven or safety. The Black studies, the intellectual camaraderie, the going to conferences and being in community with these thinkers and my colleagues. This has been a safe haven for me. And it started out that way too. I went to private school in Concord in Massachusetts, Concord Academy. And it was, just being the only Black student for a long time up to that point. And I can't remember when I graduated having more than one Black teacher in the history of my intellectual odyssey up to that point. And so my sister went to Spelman and I was hungry for an all Black space, so I went to Morehouse, applied early admission. It was the only school I applied to. And from there, it just like Morehouse was a kind of, it wasn't always this way, but at the time I was living it, it felt kind of like a paradise. It was the first place I could really think, first place I was free to experiment on the page. It was, and so, there's so much of the thinking there was Afrocentric. I went from there to UC Berkeley, where I was intending to study with Sadia Hartman. And when she left, I followed her to Columbia. And so my trajectory sort of just got deeper into, just some of these central questions of what's freedom to us, what does a safe space, what is required for us to inhabit a safe space. And And so, yeah, from there, I worked with Gayatri Spivak while I was there, and we worked on a lot of philosophy. We did a lot of Kant, and all of these things sort of came together in comp lit. So I did a comp lit degree. So yeah, it's kind of interesting because things kind of went full circle for me. I started off interested in trauma and grief, and then wrote I wrote a dissertation on the politics of humor, and then wrote my first book on social movements, and now I'm doing a book on grief and poetry and contemporary poetry. So it sort of came back to my original, desires and passions right now. So
I think there's a really interesting, and hopefully at some point we'll have a chance as part of this series to get a group of people to sit down and have a conversation about the relationship between Black studies and HBCU education, both from the professor and the former student side. Because, this has come up in previous podcasts of talking about undergraduate education of Black studies, not as like doing Africana studies at Morehouse, but being at Morehouse as a kind of Black studies education, as you said, very, having like an Afrocentric curriculum or, intellectual life and these sorts of things. And, was that, I'm interested if, having come from Concord Academy, if that was, if there were elements, at least in your study at Concord, that then got this whole new resonance at Morehouse, or was this really like a complete like world and paradigm shift?
Well, I remember taking this course on Cuba, and like the role of, and then with the course, we got a charter plane to Cuba to sort of as an extension of this class. And so I just remember, writing this, I wrote this suite of poetry, the kind of poetry collection in the voice of these political prisoners. And the first thing I felt at that time was just how similar that experience was to a lot of, I was also learning about the Black Panthers. And when I left Concord Academy, I left as a kind of like Black nationalist, So when I got to Morehouse, I was like, ready. There was a Black Panther, group at Morehouse. And so there was a beginning resonance. And what I like about how that stuff began for me is just the international dimension of the international connections. Like my mom is from Jamaica, and so I've always sort of located myself in between. My dad is Black American from the South, so I've always sort of located myself neither in the U.S. and neither in Jamaica. It's like, but just in between that space. And so there was definitely longstanding resonance, but there was nothing like getting to a campus and having, the majority of your colleagues look like you for the first time in your life, and just like, and up and down the administrative ranks, there's just sort of in the mentoring and the kind of warmth and the nurturing, it was in some ways, tied to my experience, and then just a total paradigm shift for sure.
So there's such an interesting series of things in play, right? The Black South, Jamaica, Cuba.
Yeah, and, right? Like, it's like...
And then Atlanta. I mean, there's maybe a suite of poems just on those names themselves. Totally, like, just to take a side road here for a minute, any chance you were at the MLK Center in Marianao when you were in Cuba?
No.
Yeah. In Havana? Oh, yeah. I was just like, maybe. So, yeah, I mean, because this was as a professor, but took some students to Cuba a couple of times and stayed there. So at the MLK Center, met Assata Shakur, rest in peace. Actually, one of those trips. So that's its whole own story. So let me ask you about Black Studies, right? And I want to ask how you imagine the field. What's that sort of portrait for you that you work with, part of your intellectual imagination? And I ask this in the context of its founding, which was that tension, and always say tension rather than contradiction, but that tension between the inception of Black Studies in the student demand for a place on campus to study Black life. Right. And that has given to us today this long tradition, or I mean, not that long, 50-something years tradition of the Black Studies as the place of the study of the Black intellectual tradition. So that intellectual element of the field. But of course, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when Black Studies was established, was also that moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle. And part of that radicalization was to really abolish those distinctions between classroom and community, between books and activism, between study and prescriptive action. And so, there's, I think, also that part of Black Studies which is committed to a certain kind of politics and community. And so I think there's still that tension with us today between the intellectual life of Black Studies and its commitment to certain political action. And so when we imagine the field 50-something years later, I always want to know sort of how people, what sort of portrait you have of the field, but also in that context of its founding tension.
It's such a tough question because Black Studies is so huge, right? I mean, it's proliferating, in real time. I guess, one of the things I think that has drawn me most to this particular intersection of the activism and the intellectual life, the sort of breaking down those institutional walls, is just how much we have been given license since its inception to sort of merge disciplines and sort of refuse disciplinary mandates of knowledge production. I think that the activism comes into play often in the way we write. I think most of us carry an imperative to not only write legibly and not only write to our fields or to our colleagues, but to sort of write in a way that invites the lay readers in, the people who aren't, and I just thinking about my friends, and the people I went to school with. That's a huge imperative. And so I do think that has been maintained. I think it has been hard to sort of maintain any kind of protest life while we're, struggling to get tenure and, move up the ranks and sort of protect our jobs. And so there's certain things that you can't even mention without experiencing serious vulnerability to your, certain causes. And so I think about June Jordan and just her commitment to Palestinian rights with total just total courage to and I think it's a different playing field. I think I think a lot of our overt forms of activism have been attenuated over the years for one reason or the other. When I just, you just look back at how bustling that sort of public activism was in the 60s and 70s. And we should probably, I'd say this to myself too, try to remember the kind of courage it took to get, to marshal behind very risky things,
Yeah, absolutely. And that becomes an important
Yeah.
thing to remember in this moment of the absolute siege we're under as Black studies by the federal government, right, as well as local, state, and all of that. And I think the way that's fallen off, I think about it a lot, and I've mentioned this on the podcast, but I look around my own campus and I wonder, like, who are the friends of Black studies? Like, imagine they tried to close the department. I think everyone in a Black studies department should be asking this, right? If they try to close our department, who refuses to teach until they reinstate us? And I don't think there's anybody. But then I think, well, do we have on-campus, off-campus community, or even student solidarity? And when I come up with a hesitation or maybe a no there, I think about the origins that you were just talking about. I mean, the political commitments that were there at the beginning of the field that have fallen away as it's gotten institutionalized. And I don't know what to do about that. I wish that we had resolved this problem before we were in a moment of immense political crisis. But at the same time, maybe the answer to the crisis of Black studies is the origin of Black studies.
No, and I think it's a tricky thing. The fact that we were fighting for institutionalization and institutional recognition. Well, that's going to come with its own costs. I mean, we can hold up, as a kind of point of pride that, by 1971, we had 1,000 universities, colleges, community colleges establishing Black studies units or departments. But, there was a cost to that. There's a cost to, being kind of appropriated.
Yeah, and sorting that out over the next few years, but also probably a few decades, is going to be one of the major tasks. So let me ask a little bit about your work in relation to the field. Your work, I mean, you talked a little bit about it, the multiple kinds of projects you've already been, that you've already written and thought about: humor, politics, trauma. Yeah, those are very different, but they're kind of the same. As I said them, I'm like, that kind of sounds like a series of synonyms in 2025. But, interesting cultural history, obviously literary studies and political sensibilities. And there's so much that to get so much insight to get into Black life from that collection of sensibilities. And so I'm interested in how you think of yourself in relation to the past of the field, sort of where you think your orientation and scholarly sensibilities sit in the tradition, but also what boundaries you think you push.
The boundaries question, I think with my first book, Dreaming the Present, I think one of the things that I was reconsidering is what a commitment to political radicality occludes, what it overlooks, what kind of formations, what kind of activism and politics we're just not seeing if the only thing we want to tout or the only thing we want to praise or pay close attention to is certain politics that meet our measure of radicalism. And so for boundaries, I think that that book sort of pushed the boundary of what a social movement is, and sort of just how we think of what kind of freedom we want. There's this quote from June Jordan. I don't know why it's coming to me now, but she talks about, we are the ones we've been waiting for. And the book sort of begins from that place of plenitude and can I just and I think beginning from a place of plenitude to say that we have what we already have what we need to get what we want is a very different place from the position of we're protesting or we're countering the state for something that's that hasn't arrived yet. And so there was a kind of pushing the boundaries in just terms of what futurity is. And so I was sort of excavating how we can think of the present more rapaciously, more broadly. I think that book pushed a boundary in that sense, but I also do think that there's this other side in which Black Studies has always sort of been committed to a kind of abundance thinking, right? Because one of the most important insights for me is that we don't begin with transatlantic slavery. We begin with an era before. That's not the origin point. Mm-hmm. It's an origin point maybe to a certain kind of understanding of African American life, but it's not an origin point so long as you get outside of the nation state or the American U.S. centricism, or saying that we putting our history as preceding the calamity of transatlantic slavery just opens us up to remembering all the things our ancestors knew and the things that we can we need to sustain and remember.
So let me ask, in terms, sort of building from that, ask about your graduate work and how your current position in sort of life science graduate school, how it shapes that intervention that you want to make and that connection both to the past Black studies and forging sort of new horizons for it. You mentioned your PhD was in comparative literature, right? Which is a kind of disciplinary education. I always hesitate to call comparative literature a discipline because I think it has an adventurousness to it that's a little bit different than a discipline. But then you're also in a Department of English, which is obviously a disciplinary, but also in the Department of African American Studies. So you have this sort of interesting movement between discipline and non-disciplinary work, right, in terms of your training and your workplace. And I'm interested in how you think that movement between discipline and non-discipline or anti-discipline or multidiscipline, however you want to think about it, how you think that shapes how you understand a research project. And also, if you want, how it shapes how you conceive and execute a classroom. I think in particular, you're working on a film, right? Doing screenplay, getting involved in production, which is both, obviously, if you were a film studies person, that would have a sort of centrality there, but that's part of Black studies. That's outside of disciplines, but it's also very much obviously indebted to that kind of training.
It's a great question. I mean, let me give you a quick example, right? So I'm writing this book on grief, and I'm writing a book on a new language for grief in contemporary Black poetry since the end of the 70s. So actually, since the collapse and a lot of the revolutions and the dreams that we had been fighting for sort of came to a close. From the Grenada Revolution to the Black Power movement, a lot of this stuff came to a close by early 80s. And I'm thinking of how much people need to, or feel that they need to, respond to Freud's mourning and melancholia in order to write about contemporary grief, or to carve out the landscape of what an elegy looks like, or what, and that's the kind of thing I think a Black studies education can just allow you to say, no, that's not, that Freud isn't going to determine the map or delineate the boundaries of this map that I then need to cross. And so I think one of the most beautiful things about this being cross-disciplinary, as incredibly hard as it is to sort of learn the different things that each discipline is offering uniquely, from the question of time and the archive with history to, how we, what's the cultural artifact with literature, like all of these, it's arduous work, but at the same time, it allows you freedom to say that question that seems to be central to this location of this field is not something I need to take the time to distract myself with to get this kind of, argument laid out, right? And so there's a kind of there's just a kind of license, there's a kind of freedom that has given us, and that's given me. I mean, I was working. I for my comp lit degree, I was working with a whole bunch of languages and studying ancient Greek, Spanish, and French, and so there was just this, post-colonial training I was getting with, working with Gayatri, and at the same time, I'm working with Sadia and Brent Edwards, and Brent both of them being incredibly devoted to the historical archive, and so and so there was a beautiful confluence of how to read a cultural artifact in history and how to read the many ways that's translated across different spaces. And so it did come together in a sort of way. And so and that cross-pollination sort of continues. I mean, the like my book on the Black cooperative movement, there was, it sort of had to attend to some social science conceptions of a social movement where that has been, pretty elaborately worked out, and working from that to the archive. But I do think that for me, everything sort of is centered in the historical archive, and whether that archive is in a collection in a library, whether that's in somebody's house, whether that, but there is a certain way that all of these things come together for me in the archive.
I love that. Yeah, it's one of those things where I think when we talk about Black studies and its anti or multidisciplinary character, I think a sort of default mode can often be to push to the side what disciplines offer. And I really love the way you're able to sort of pull in, what a disciplinary training actually does, but also what can be done with it. That sort of, I don't want to say retooling, but that like redeployment in a different context, because there's something so expansive about, what does it mean to have an expressive artifact and try to make sense of it. Right. Or just to have an event or a figure, like Hamer, and sort of say, how do I make sense of Hamer as a thinker of time, as an intellectual? It requires, as you say, so many of those things that both come from disciplines, but also require a sort of post-disciplinary approach. I mean, that's the thing about your book. I mean, I love the book. I learned so much from it, not just about the particular things you talked about, but just what it means to talk in this kind of way about historical actors, rather than sort of people who have ready-made essays for theoretical interpretation. But I was like, how do I even characterize this book? I knew that you had done a comp lit PhD, but I was like, this is really like between all kinds of disciplines, because as you said, you can't just not engage history or social scientific material in order to make sense of the problems you pose for yourself in the book.
I mean, and that's the thing. I think what I love about just to go back to that question of the founding of Black studies. I mean, what I think they had was a respect at the same time that they understood that this was cross-disciplinary. They had a respect for the particular methodologies that disciplines were offering. I mean, just take a figure like Du Bois, whose work we inherit into the 60s and early 70s, and Fred Hampton and these folks they're not simply, just blowing to the wind the kind of approaches that defines different disciplines, but they're in respect of it. And I just think when I'm looking at a sociological study, I just have to honor that this is a different methodology. This is a different approach. The historical study, it's a different approach. And literary study of the form of the artifact and how that moves and is disseminated and all these things and the readings that we can do. That's also a different approach. And, I don't know if I have always a clear delineation of the differences. I do think they themselves sort of move around, but I sort of felt like I was trying to take the best of what those had to offer in order to just kind of work out like what these were folks who were establishing a movement that they called the Black Cooperative Movement, right? They labeled it themselves. And so I was trying to use everything I could to sort of figure out what they meant by movement, how they were thinking about pooling their resources. I mean, if this is people were establishing, take Hamer, for example. I mean, by the mid 70s, she had established a daycare center, 680-acre farm. She had disseminated food. She had given food out to folks who were whose lives were devastated by hurricanes in Chicago. She was operating on a level of a polymath, or like however you understand like how her brain had to stretch. She was writing grants. She was speaking. I mean, there's certain like the ways in which her thinking had to spread and move, like to track all that. You sort of just need to get as much as you can from anything you can to sort of figure out like how deep and how profound this was. And so I do sort of think like the questions that we're interested in sort of demand. It's not even like it's a choice. They sort of demand that we bring to them various disciplinary tools in order to figure them out. I mean, the question of what freedom is. I mean, that's sort of a principal, motivating question for the field, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I do think we just need to engage them. We also need to just have respect for their limits and their value.
Yeah, I like that idea of use everything, because
everything.
The people we're talking about used everything they had, right? Well, it was like knowledge. Who was it? Oh, Jarvis McInnes. I mean, you and I are talking before his podcast came out, but it'll have been out by the time we talk. By the time yours does, but he was talking about like how to think about the farmer as an intellectual, right? As somebody who has this, it has something to say about something more than just soil, right? It has something to say about land, space, collectivity, and so forth. And I think about, the demands that Black Studies puts on us as intellectuals is partly being a collection of approaches, but also those very questions, as you were just saying, like, how do you make sense of Hamer in this expansive project? Well, it's going to require everything, just as it required everything for her. So
it's going to require everything.
So let me, as part of the first of the last two questions I have for you, thinking about the history and future of Black Studies, what do you think that the field has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well? I
think there's just so much we've done well. There's so much we've done well in terms of our grounded knowledge. Thinking about, you're talking about the farmer as an intellectual. I mean, how do you talk about the farmer as an intellectual? I don't want to transgress my, but I sort of embodied knowledge. Mm-hmm. The erotics. One of the things I think we do uniquely well is talk about the way knowledge and practice lives in our bodies, the way we create, the way we have a fully aesthetic life in the midst of ruins. Just that. I mean, it's a universal issue, but it's also a particularly Black issue. How do you navigate creating beauty in a devastatingly ugly world? And what are the politics of that? I think in terms of these central questions of creativity and how people, regular people, have so much to teach us, how our ancestors have so much to teach us, what they were doing on the plantation to survive. I mean, our vernacular knowledge, right? The way we attend to the vernacular is beautiful. Not to mention just the beauty of our writing. I think one of the things that I love, I mean, the reason that Black Studies scholarship has become and been increasingly, like, it's increasingly more of a refuge. The harder the world gets to live, this becomes a safe haven. Is the beautiful writing that we do. Jennifer Nash has this her latest book, How We Write Now, I think it's called, or she's talking about like, just intellectualizing beauty and turning that into a kind of analytic through which we can understand the way Black feminist scholarship has been generated. And I just think, on the level of craft, on the level of the page, that is something we have been doing pretty well. And we also, again, we have that imperative to speak, to have a public facing side. I mean, so many folks, you talk about Abdul, you talk about Leonard, who was on here, they have these are my wonderful colleagues who have a important public facing side to their work. And I think that that's kind of persistent and consistent. So I could go on and on. I mean, but yeah.
What do you think is not done particularly well?
I would say that I was listening to. Okay, first thing is, we have these departments. We have African studies and we have African American studies, and usually they're in different buildings. But it is interesting how little conversation that we establish between these departments. And I think
it's really true.
We should think about that, and we should, and that is in relationship to, I know, JT, you had him on, and I was listening to him respond to this same question, and I'm kind of with him on this. The question of nation state is something that we could do a lot better on. And, we do, and it's also because the work is so hard that it is hard to be diasporic all the time. And, it shouldn't necessarily be everybody's project, but I do think that we have the internationalism or the transnationalism of our work could definitely deepen, widen. So I don't think we can ever forget, that we are located in a diaspora of differences. To think of Brent Edwards' practice of diaspora. I mean, I don't think we can ever forget that that's where we emerge from, and it's not a question of necessarily similarity, but also, and more so, a question of these differences, how these differences collide to create new worlds. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting putting together this podcast. Ashley and I talked from the beginning about the importance of getting Caribbean, Afro-Latino, and African researchers and scholars on the podcast. But then when you start to go find people in departments, you just look at the website. That's how you get their email and contact them, seeing how hard it is to find substantial numbers of scholars of Africa in Black Studies departments. And, goes really, that in that way is this sort of like internet browsing sort of confirmation of this thing that I think the field has wanted to do better, but figuring out how to do it better. Why is it that African studies would be one place and African American studies is another, is a question for everybody. And maybe that's already kind of a response to the last question I have for you, which is, thinking about the future of Black studies and Black studies and, maybe in this time of political crisis, what's the one question you would want us to all be asking, or the one issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
Well, that's a big question. I will say that
no one ever has one.
So no one ever
feel free to have a couple.
It's a lot, but I will say that one of the things I'm thinking about when now that I'm writing on grief and writing on quieter forms of grief that sort of are not in, like, they're not spectacularized. This isn't grief about, a Black person getting killed at the hands of the police. This isn't grief that necessarily foments a movement. This is much quieter grief. And even if that's the kind of event that these poets are grieving, it still takes you into the interior life of a family in ways that are not appropriable to the media. So all that said is all that. Having said all that, I wonder what kind of knowledge we would be able to create, or what kind of things we would see or would become more visible if we took off the mandate of resistance or the romance of resistance. I mean, resistive literature, resistive political actors, just the very category of resistance is still the currency with which we trade. And so it's not to say that is not critical, right? But what happens when we say, when we suspend that desire to find resistance in something? What happens to the kind of political formations that we'll be able to attend to when it's just a little bit more muddy than that, when there's just a lot more co-implication, there's a lot more entanglement that just can't be subsumed under that label, whether it's refusal, whether it's resistance, whether it's counter-consciousness. Okay, when we take those labels off and we look at these people living their lives, whether, what do we see when we're not trying to find that in their life practice?
I love that. That's an amazing place to wrap up. I think that question of what is humanity in its everydayness is one of the more, on the one hand, it sounds like the most obvious thing to just simply, look at. But of course, those things that are closest to us are often hardest to understand.
Yeah,
because those, as you said, those interpretive paradigms, they have deep roots and they've revealed amazing things about our world. But I like that as a different way of looking at ourselves and our world. So thank you for that. This has been a fantastic conversation, Irvin. I really appreciate it so much. I was really looking forward to it, and everything I was hoping. There's so much here for people to think about, and this is a great contribution to the series. So thank you.
Thanks, John.
Right. Well, you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
All right. Bye-bye.